So the new moon is within the dark moon. Welcome kindreds, it's Jessica, and in this video I'm going to talk about the dark moon and the new moon and the differences between these two. I see an awful lot of like weird information about what these phases of the moon actually are and what they mean, and so I'm hoping in this video I'm going to be able to explain them so that you understand them, like what they mean astronomically as well as astrologically, and in terms of how we connect with them as witches or seekers or people wanting to live in tune with the moon phases. So let's talk about the dark moon first, as that one's the kind of easiest bit to explain. To us on Earth, it looks like the sun and the moon and all the other planets like rise and set in the sky. And you've probably noticed that they rise and set in like a certain area of the sky. So like the sun, it doesn't always rise in exactly the same place, but it's more or less the same place. You know, it rises in the east, we all know, and it sets in the west. And that is the same for the moon, although I find that not everyone realizes that. And it's also the same for all of the other planets as well. It is that band of sky, the ecliptic, that we look at. And that's where our ancestors looked at, and they could see these things like moving across the sky as it appears to us on Earth. So far, so straightforward. So the moon rises and it sets, but it rises and sets at different times every day. Obviously the sun also rises and sets at different times, but that takes like a whole year for that cycle, so that we know that cycle more, the day cycle. We're more like naturally aware of that because we live our lives, you know, in our society now, we live our lives by the day cycle of the sun. So we're aware of like what time sunrise is and what time sunset is. But moonrise and moonset moves throughout the course of a month. So the moon doesn't rise and set at the same time for a more prolonged period like the sun does. Does that make sense? So when it's the new moon time, the moon is rising and setting at the same time, more or less, as the sun. Whereas when it is full moon time, the moon is rising and setting at the opposite time. So when the sun sets, the moon rises. I'll try and do like, let me grab a couple of bits and pieces and I'll try and do like a demonstration, because I think that will help to explain this a little bit better. This is not going to be like a perfect demonstration, but I'll do my best to kind of show what is going on. So imagine this is the Earth, this gorgeous stone that my friend drew for me, and this little disc is going to be the moon. So the moon is going around the sun, and the moon takes a whole month to make an orbit, which that is why that we only see the one side of the moon, because the moon is turning as it goes around, so we only ever see the one side of the moon, which leads to all those like things about there being weird stuff happening on the other side of the moon and stuff like that. So I'm not going to get into any of that here. This is focusing on what is the dark moon, what is the new moon, and like how we can lean into the energy of those times. So I got my lamp here. I wonder if I can move it. Okay, so there's the Earth, and you can kind of see that the sun is shining on the Earth. So the sun is shining on the Earth, the moon is going around, yeah? So, sorry, I'm not looking at this now, I'm looking at the at the picture so I can see what's going on. So when the moon is here, the other side, so the sun is over here, my lamp, which is just off the thing here, I couldn't drag it any further across. So the sun is coming from here, and the moon is on the opposite side. So the moon here is getting all of the light of the sun, hitting the face of the moon, and that is why when the moon is opposite the sun, it is full moon, yeah? And that's when it obviously appears brightest, it appears like a full circle in the sky. If you study astrology, you'll know this as well, that when the sun is like in Cancer, let's say, then the moon, the full moon, will be in the opposite sign of Capricorn. Does that make sense? And as the moon continues to move around, less and less, if we're going this way, light is reflected back to the Earth, because the light source is coming from here. So the light can't reflect the full, it can only reflect the full circle when the orb is here. And as it moves around, because light travels in straight lines, it is reflecting like less and less of the light. So as it gets nearer and nearer the sun, which we're saying is here, sorry, I'm keeping on looking at the demonstration instead of looking at you guys. But yeah, when the moon is here, the same face of the moon is still facing towards us on Earth, but the moon and the sun are in the same part of the sky, and the moon is rising at the same time and setting at the same time as the sun. So when the light is shining, I'll put the earth down for a second. So the light is coming from the sun and hitting the moon, but that light is all going bounced back off. The reflecting is happening back towards the sun. So in that time, the new moon or the dark moon, I'll explain which is which in a moment, the light is bouncing back off there and none of it is reaching us here on Earth. When some people get it confused with an eclipse, they say that the moon is making a shadow in between the sun and the Earth. We only get a solar eclipse when the moon is like exactly in front of the sun, because the sun is so much bigger and the moon is so much smaller. Even though they're kind of sort of in the same part of the sky, every time we get a dark moon, they're not like exactly in the same place. We only get the solar eclipses when the moon is much more close to the sun. I hope all this is making sense. I may cut this bit out. I just think sometimes it helps to see a more like kind of concrete demonstration of it, although I'm not doing an excellent job of it, so excuse that. So yeah, we're the Earth here, and when the moon is close to the sun, we can't see that light anymore because the light is all being reflected the opposite way back towards the sun. None of the light is reaching us here on Earth. Also, like in practical terms, because the moon is rising and setting with the sun at that point, the sun is obviously so much brighter than the moon that we can't see it anyway. We see the sun, we're not going to see the moon. We only start to see the moon when the moon and the sun start to separate that little bit, and then we can see the moon again. So all of that period of time in the month when the moon is very, very close to the sun, that is the dark moon time, and it's called the dark moon because we can't see the moon. So that is about 3 days or so of the month when, from our perspective on Earth, we can't see the moon at all. Okay, so that was kind of the easy bit, the explaining of the dark moon. The moon is rising and setting with the sun. We can't see it. So from our view here on Earth, the moon has disappeared from the sky. It is dark. And we'll get into like what the energy of that means in a moment, but let's talk about what new moon means. And this is where things start to go a little bit awry and different. I see lots of different descriptions of what that actually is. So I've seen people say that the new moon from a magical perspective is different from what we would call a new moon from an astrological perspective or an astronomical perspective, but it's really not. The same moon, the moon is the same moon, the way we talk about it in using astrology or astronomy or magic, those are just like different languages to describe what we see around us. And I don't think it's helpful to like separate it out into being, well, scientists say this, but we as magical practitioners, we say this. It's not so much that, it's just that we're using different language to talk about the same things. So for me, and like I've been working with the moon for over 25 years now, and I find that the new moon point, as it is like labeled astrologically, and what you'll see, like if you get like a lunar calendar or an almanac or something like this, it has the new moon times, and those new moon times occur during, never try and film during Mercury retrograde. Those new moon times occur during the dark moon. So the dark moon is like a period of time. It is a chunk of about 3 days, like I said, where the moon is invisible to us. The new moon is a point in time, an exact point in time, partway within the dark moon. So the new moon is within the dark moon, and it is that moment in time when the moon and the sun are together. So at the beginning of the dark moon, the moon is like catching up to the sun. It's invisible to us because it's so close to the sun, but it still hasn't quite got to the same place where the sun is in the sky. So it's dark. And then the new moon point is when the sun and the moon are together, and they'll give it to you to the minute in the almanacs and stuff. It's that moment, boom, new moon. And we still can't see it. It happens in the dark, this new moon point. But you can feel it. You can feel the change if you lean in. So the new moon is within the dark moon. It is that moment of time within the dark moon when the moon becomes new. It becomes born again. It's swallowed by the sun and rebirthed. And then the moon passes past the sun. And then we start to see it again, you know, a few days later, we'll start to see the crescent. And a lot of people say that from a magical perspective, from a witchy perspective, the time when we start saying this is a new moon is when you see that first little sliver of light. But that's the crescent. That's the crescent moon. And what they're saying is not wrong. You know, they're saying, you know, that's the time when you work towards beginnings and kind of starting things and, getting, you know, it's the beginnings of things because it's that first little sliver of light. That's completely correct. That is correct. But I think it's like it glosses over and we lose the nuance of that different quality of time within the dark moon void. And so in this video, I really wanted to make that more clear, that we have this period of time, which is the dark moon. Dark, we can't see it, and then within that dark moon, halfway within that dark moon, we have the point of new moon, and that is when the moon moves from being the end of the cycle to being born again. And that happens in the dark. It's like conception, you know, like human conception, like animal conception, mammals, I suppose. I don't know how it happens for all different animals, but the moment of conception happens in the void. It happens in the womb space, or in, you know, around that space. It is hidden from our view. So if we think about that, if we think about that void time, the time before the new moon, the end of the cycle, is the void. But that energy is tomb energy. It is the breaking down. It is the blending into all that is, you know, the individual finally like separating out and becoming one again with everything. That is the dark moon tomb time, the time before the new moon, when the moon is dark. And then we get to that new moon point and it's like, feel it, feel into it. And suddenly, instead of tomb time, it becomes womb time, and something new is there, they're ready. It hasn't taken form properly yet. You know, that will definitely happen more as the moon gets larger and larger. It will become more concrete, more visible. It's what I was talking about in the last moon video I did about moon magic and how people kind of misunderstand moon magic. So I wanted to really draw attention to that shift, that change, and so that we don't miss out on that conception time, because all of that time in the dark is really sacred time. You know, we have got that tomb time, that time for like destroying, for getting rid of things, for banishing, for sending things away from us, for like breaking things down. And then we have this shift into that womb time of something new has been conceived. And that is very different. Well, not very different, but it is definitely of a different quality from the crescent moon time. You can think of the crescent moon time perhaps more as like when the pregnancy is much more obvious to the naked eye, you know, it's become like tangible in a way. Whereas in the womb time, because it's all still within the void, within the dark moon, it is still intangible, but it's definitely something. It's becoming. It's something. It is something becoming. And like our language kind of breaks down at this point because it's hard to talk about these things which are like becoming. Yeah. So I'm hoping that that all makes sense and gives you something to think about. Perhaps you're already working with that idea of like tomb and womb in that dark moon time, but it's not something that I see talked about very often, so I wanted to make a video about it and explain it better here. If you'd like to see more about my moon information and stuff, I've got a whole playlist which I will link somewhere around here, and if you have any questions or comments about this, then please do leave them down below. I always do. I'm not always the quickest, but I always do respond to questions and things like that, so yeah, pop them in the thing down below. Thank you so much for watching. Warmest blessings, and I will see you very soon.